Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas. And his Catholic faith is day 105. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 88 and 89 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of venial sin and mortal sin, and of venial sin in itself. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether venial sin is fittingly condivided with mortal sin. Mortal or deadly sin is distinct from venial sin in that mortal sin is, as Augustine said, a word, deed, or desire contrary to the eternal law. It is a deliberate choice against our ultimate end and goal, which is God. Venial sins are not like this. They are called sins because they are words, deeds, or desires which did not perfectly measure up to right reason for some reason in the means. However, they do not have the perversion of intending the incorrect final end or goal. In other words, the man who eats a little too much or speaks a little too much may miss the mark in this or that particular way, and yet in doing so still possess the habit of charity and still be aiming at the glory of God as his or her habitual, ongoing goal. However, the guy who commits adultery or takes the life of an innocent person cannot do so without, at the same time, acting in contempt of their due end. So when it comes to venial sins, which can be ironically more difficult to understand than mortal sins, St. Thomas writes, venial sin is called a sin in reference to an imperfect notion of sin. For it is not against the law, since he who sins venially neither does what the law forbids, nor omits what the law prescribes to be done, but he acts beside the law, through not observing the mode of reason which the law intends. And we will have many more articles and therefore opportunities to continue to understand venial sin. Article 2, whether mortal and venial sin differ generically. Venial and mortal sins differ generically because their objects are normally generically distinct. Like blasphemy and adultery would be categorically different, especially in their gravity, to an idle word or talking too much. These are Aquinas' examples. And this is because blasphemy and adultery are objectively, essentially contrary to our last end, in a way that an idle word or excessive talking may just be a poor means, but directed towards the correct end. Moreover, it's important to note that the intention or disposition of the acting agent can also affect the moral character of our actions. For example, if a man talks excessively for the sake of committing adultery, or eats a little too much, not haphazardly, but because he has placed his ultimate end and happiness in sensual pleasure, then these sins, which we would take to be generically venial, can become mortal or deadly in their character. It also works the other way around in some cases, in that a sin which would be in its genus mortal actually can be only venial. And as an example of that, this is St. Thomas. He says, it may happen on the part of the agent that a sin generically mortal becomes venial by reason of the act being imperfect, i.e., not deliberated by reason, which is the proper principle of an evil act, as we have said above in reference to sudden movements of unbelief. However, in general, and in response to our article, St. Thomas continues, there are certain generic venial sins and certain generic mortal sins. Article 3, whether venial sin is a disposition to mortal sin. Do venial sins make one more likely or more disposed to fall into eventual mortal sin? As it is written in Sirach chapter 19, he who despises small things will fail little by little. So in two ways, venial sin can dispose someone to mortal sin. In the first way, by a kind of slippery slope, such as when, Lord forbid, eating too much or speaking too much leads one to place their ultimate end or happiness in one of these trivial temporal things. In a second way, by habituating a person to depart from the law of reason, if only in particular and seemingly insignificant things, which can dispose them to at one point departing from the rule of reason in regard to larger things, in regard to their last end, which would make for mortal sin. Article 4, whether a venial sin can become mortal, and only in the sense that venial sins can set us up or dispose us to some eventual mortal sin, in the manner we have said already, or as Aquinas says, insofar as one may fix one's end in that venial sin, or direct it to some mortal sin as end, as stated above. And so we'll move on to Article 5. Article 5, whether a circumstance can make a venial sin to be mortal. St. Thomas gives us some insightful words here, recapitulating much of what we said about circumstances in general, as well as their relationship to the species of an act. And so it's worth quoting Aquinas at length here. He writes, a circumstance as such is an accident of the moral act. An accident here means like substance accident, so not the essence of the act. And yet a circumstance may happen to be taken as the specific difference of a moral act, and then it loses its nature of circumstance and constitutes the species of the moral act. This happens in sins when a circumstance adds the deformity of another genus. Thus, when a man has knowledge of another woman than his wife, the deformity of his act is opposed to chastity. But if this other be another man's wife, there is an additional deformity opposed to justice, which forbids one to take what belongs to another. And accordingly, this circumstance constitutes a new species of sin known as adultery. In other words, if the circumstance changes the specific kind of act, the act is like changing fornication into adultery, as in Aquinas' example, then we just include that circumstance into the nature of the act and don't consider it as only a mere circumstance in that case. However, if a circumstance is really just a circumstance, St. Thomas is of the opinion that it cannot affect the nature of the act in such a way as to make it mortal instead of just venial. In his words, it is evident that a circumstance cannot make a venial sin to be mortal so long as it remains a circumstance, but only when it transfers the sin to another species or kind and becomes, as it were, the specific difference of the moral act. Article 6, whether a mortal sin can become venial. St. Thomas answers this article very briefly. He says, a sin which is generically mortal can become venial by reason of the imperfection of the act, because then it does not completely fulfill the conditions of a moral act, since it is not a deliberate but a sudden act. This happens by a kind of subtraction, namely of deliberate reason. And since a moral act takes its species from deliberate reason, the result is that by such a subtraction, the species of the act is destroyed. This idea is also captured by the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which writes, for a sin to be mortal, 3 conditions must be together met. Mortal sin is sin whose object is grave matter, and which is also committed with full knowledge and deliberate consent. If these conditions are not met, then the sin would not be mortal, but only venial. And with that, we move on to question 89 of venial sin in itself. Article 1, whether venial sin causes a stain on the soul. Very briefly from Aquinas, stain denotes something permanent in the thing stained, wherefore it seems in the nature of a loss of habitual rather than of actual comeliness. Therefore, properly speaking, venial sin does not cause a stain in the soul. So since venial sin does not cause, for example, the loss of the supernatural habit in the will, which is charity, then we don't call it a stain on the soul. Article 2, whether venial sins are suitably designated as wood, hay, and stubble. Beginning with the verse of Scripture from which we receive these terms, it is written in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and this is a chapter commonly used to explain purgatory. St. Paul writes, "Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each man's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed with fire. And the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work which any man has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire." So St. Thomas takes this passage to denote in wood, hay, or straw, which is burned up, yet a man is still saved, as venial sins, which is a great read on this passage, because if a man does in fact die with a foundation in Christ, then we can safely say he did not die in mortal sin. And yet, if he is still suffering, he cannot be in heaven. Therefore, it follows quite naturally that this person who died in Christ must be suffering from venial sins in a place we call purgatory. St. Thomas continues in writing, "We must therefore say that the very venial sins that insinuate themselves into those who have a care for earthly things are designated by wood, hay, and stubble. For just as these are stored in a house without belonging to the substance of the house and can be burnt while the house is saved, so also venial sins are multiplied in a man while the spiritual edifice remains, and for them man suffers fire, either of temporal trials in this life or of purgatory after this life, and yet he is saved forever." Article 3, whether man could commit a venial sin in the state of innocence. Could man, before the loss of original justice, sin venially? And St. Thomas says no, and here is his reasoning. Venial sin occurs in us either through the imperfection of the act, as in the case of sudden movements, or through some inordinateness in respect of things referred to the end, the due order of the end being safeguarded. Now, each of these happens on account of some defect of order by reason of the lower powers not being checked by the higher. In other words, Adam and Eve would not have had unruly passions to battle against, and as a result causing imperfection in their actions. So St. Thomas continues, in the state of innocence, there was an unerring stability of order, so that the lower powers were always subjected to the higher, so long as man remained subject to God. Hence, there can be no inordinateness in man unless, first of all, the highest part of man were not subject to God, which constitutes a mortal sin. From this it is evident that in the state of innocence man could not commit a venial sin before committing a mortal sin. Article 4, whether a good or a wicked angel can sin venially. And they can't, because just as they, unlike ourselves, do not proceed from principles to conclusions in thought, but simply see the relevant conclusions at the same moment and within the thought of some principle, so too, unlike us, they do not need to proceed from some intended end to then figuring out the fitting means to that end. They see the means in the end, and they see it correctly, not being hampered by any disorder in their nature, pre-fall for the demons at least, and having their knowledge being infused into them by God, which is still the case for the angels, fallen or not. All this to say, an angel cannot mistake the means to some intended end, like they cannot mistake the necessary conclusions which follow upon some principle. Therefore, in response to our article, venial sin, which regards the means, cannot be found in good or wicked angels. Article 5, whether the first movements of the sensuality in unbelievers are mortal sin. Are antecedent passions or emotions felt before they can be consciously willed, before the will can engage them in conscious, deliberate choice of an unbeliever, mortally sinful? And we can respond confidently in the negative. For a sin to be considered a sin at all, it must in some way be voluntary. And since post-fall our passions have a mind of their own, we can say, in the sense that we feel things simply based on sensual apprehension before our will can even get into the mix, and choose deliberately, then, in a word from St. Thomas, the sensuality itself could not be the subject of mortal sin, as stated already. Now the sensuality has the same nature in unbelievers as in believers. Therefore, it is not possible for the mere movements of the sensuality in unbelievers to be mortal sins. Article 6, in our last article, whether venial sin can be in anyone with original sin alone. Beginning with St. Thomas, man is punished for original sin in the children's limbo, where there is no pain of sense, as we shall state further on, whereas men are punished in hell for no other than mortal sin. Therefore, there will be no place where a man can be punished for venial sin with no other than original sin. When it comes to the limbo of the infants, first of all, to my understanding, we have no magisterial declaration on the notion, although one could interpret the Council of Florence from the 15th century as opening the theological possibility of it in writing. But the souls of those who depart this life in actual mortal sin or in original sin alone go down straight away to hell to be punished, but with unequal pains. So unequal pains here may be what St. Thomas has in mind with the phrase children's limbo, to be distinguished from the pains of those who die in mortal sin as well. That aside, and back to our article, why is it that one cannot have venial sin without mortal sin? And it is because we will the end before we then will the means to that end. This is always the case, as we covered in episodes 61 and 62 of this podcast. In an example, one must first intend to go to church on Sunday before they can then determine the best ways or means to get there, and then actually carry out that best means or ways of getting there. In the same way, before any error in the means can result, the end must be intended. And since even with ends themselves, they can be directed towards other ends, like the goal of getting to church, causing the goal of getting the kids dressed, etc., then before some particular goal or end can be intended, the final end or goal must be intended before it. Therefore, if someone wills, at the moment they reach the age of reason, the correct end, or the end in accord with right reason, as it can be known to them at that particular age and time they find themselves, then in this moment they will not sin, to say the very least. And Aquinas will have much more to say than that, as we will. But if when someone reaches the age of reason and then voluntarily wills a disordered end, as again their capacity allows at this time, by willing the incorrect end voluntarily, they will have sinned mortally, since that is the definition of mortal sin, intending the inordinate ultimate end. In St. Thomas's words, and this is a place where we should definitely quote him at length, he says, "It is impossible for venial sin to be in anyone with original sin alone and without mortal sin. The reason for this is because before a man comes to the age of discretion, the lack of years hinders the use of reason and excuses him from mortal sin. Wherefore, much more does it excuse him from venial sin, if he does anything which is such generically. But when he begins to have the use of reason, he is not entirely excused from the guilt of venial or mortal sin. Now, the first thing that occurs to a man to think about then is to deliberate about himself. And if he then direct himself to the due end, he will, by means of grace, receive the remission of original sin. Whereas if he does not then direct himself to the due end, and as far as he is capable of discretion at that particular age, he will sin mortally. For through not doing that which is in his power to do, accordingly, thenceforward there cannot be venial sin in him without mortal, until afterwards all sin shall have been remitted to him through grace." Now, this is an article which almost seems to provide more questions than answers, which an in-depth treatment of would go beyond the aim of this podcast. But I will say, for those who are interested, the most lucid treatment of this article I have ever come across is the fourth appendix of the 27th volume of what is sometimes called the Gilby Summa, published by Cambridge University Press. As a final word, I would simply say that this article from St. Thomas brings together, quite remarkably, at least a few major Catholic tenets into harmony with one another. The first is the nature of mortal sin. The second, the universal salvific will of God. And thirdly, that sanctifying grace, which along with the rest of God's graces, must come from Him as gifts, if we are to receive them. So referring one to the text or to that appendix I referred to, if they'd like to learn more, we will conclude this episode. We have just finished questions 88 and 89 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of venial sin and mortal sin, and of venial sin in itself. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.